Hello and a very warm welcome to Money Control. I am Shweta Punj. India will finally get its first data privacy law. There will finally be some rules and regulations that will govern how data of its citizens is processed and used. Well, there has been a lot of debate and discussion around the new data law, and I have with me the man who has played a very key role in drafting this new data law. Many congratulations, Mr. Chandrashekhar. It's been a Herculean task. Several drafts have been put together, junked, and finally we have a law that's passed the Lok Sabha and it's going to be tabled in the Rajya Sabha today. Yes. I want you to tell us, what is the big motive behind this data law, since a lot of global companies are closely watching it? Data is the new oil. There is a lot of interest. So what is the message that the Indian government is putting out?
Look, first of all, I mean, for your viewers, you know, this journey for data protection and personal data protection started way back in 2012-13, when the then UPA government were collecting all of these big databases, ostensibly to launch Aadhaar, and there were repeated instances of that data being breached, right, and being available to people. I flashed, I remember a large sheaf of Aadhaar entities which I picked up from Palika Bazaar at 50 rupees per entry. And so there was this real outcry that people felt that their personal data was being misused and exploited. And around that time, a number of us then approached the Supreme Court because the government was not very responsive. And fast forward from that 2012-13 time frame to 2017, the Supreme Court found, as a result of our petitions, I was an MP then, that in India, privacy is a fundamental right. Right. And post 2017, our government, Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji, then directed the ministry to draft a law that will actualize the framework under which this privacy as a fundamental right finding of the Supreme Court could be protected for consumers, and at the same time allowing this large innovation economy that was growing and innovating and attracting investments and creating jobs around the data economy, around the consumer internet and the internet, could also thrive. And so the first cut of that bill, if you remember, was a 2018-19 version of the bill that went to a joint committee of parliament. Unfortunately, that time frame was a COVID time frame, and maybe people were a little less present and intensely involved in that bill. But what came out of committee, of which I was a member, was a way too complex formulation that would have certainly protected the citizens' rights, but would have in a lot of ways crippled the innovation economy, created a compliance framework that was way too complex, and the bill, draft bill at that time, trespassed into many different areas, including electronics and trust and so on and so forth. So back to the drawing board, the Prime Minister sent us in 2022, and in the last few months we sat down, had a large number of consultations, created a framework which we believe is very modern, very future ready, and most importantly manages to address three seemingly contradictory issues. One is unambiguously protecting citizens' rights to personal data protection. Second is creating a not very compliance intensive but an ease of doing business consistent with that framework for our data and startup economy, and carve out the emergent conditions under which the government can access the personal data, which is lawful. So these three seemingly complex and contradictory objectives have been met by the bill. I personally think, and I think a large number of people who look at this with the ability to read it and understand it, think of this as a very contemporary, future-ready legislation. And I am very confident that the moment is enacted, that the big practice of exploitation and misuse of personal data, that is very prevalent, as you know, will come to a grinding halt. We want to put the brakes on the almost unfettered practice of many platforms, including some very big tech platforms,
Right.
of using and misusing and exploiting personal data to advance their own business goals and business models.
Okay.
This bill will certainly put a break to that.
Okay, so you bring up three very interesting points. You said that you wanted to not hurt the innovation economy, you wanted to protect citizens' rights, and you wanted a structure around which government can also access data
Right.
for whatever their needs. Now, there has been some criticism around, the way the bill has been passed, that there was not much debate and discussion around it. Also, that government gets access to data without individuals' consent.
Right.
What was so the worry here right now is that there's going to be constant surveillance. The Editors Guild has also come out saying that they're concerned how this could hurt press freedom. Was it warranted? Was such unbridled access by the government warranted?
Sure. Let's be very clear. I think there are a group of people who are over-invested in this narrative, and any reasonable reading of the bill will find repeatedly that they are wrong. There is nothing unfettered about the access that the government has to personal data, first of all.
Okay.
Second of all, this argument or this proposition that is being put forth that the government has access to personal data is flat wrong.
Okay.
Because consent of the individual, consent of the citizen who is actually transacting with the private sector platform or the government entity, the consent is built into the architecture of this bill.
Yeah.
And so any exception to that is only in the event of a national security incident, in case of a pandemic, in case of an earthquake. You can fairly well imagine that if the law enforcement agencies are tracking a terrorist,
Sure.
you don't expect the law enforcement agency to knock on the door of a terrorist and say, can I have your consent to track you or
Right.
check your data? Certainly, exactly the same way in the event of a pandemic or an earthquake. If a person needs a blood transfusion, you can't very well go to that person and say, can you now give me consent to check your blood group? So these are very carefully carved out exceptional circumstances which the government must have.
Right.
Public service delivery entities must have for the larger objective of law and order, of the larger objective of maintaining safety and delivering safety during a pandemic or an earthquake. That is also an obligation on the part of the government.
Sure.
So therefore, to deliver on those obligations of the government has lawful and very narrowly exceptional circumstances under which it can access personal data. So
Okay.
a lot of the, let's say, the people who are arguing are absolutists about privacy. And privacy in our scheme of things, fundamental rights in our scheme of things, are fundamental, not absolute. So there are always reasonable restrictions, including for free speech, that are cast in the Constitution.
Sure.
Same way for privacy, there are some reasonable restrictions, and those
Right.
reasonable restrictions are to do with national security,
Okay.
public emergencies in circumstances like the pandemic and the earthquake, for example.
So government agencies will take consent from individuals, from citizens,
Yes.
in case they want to process the data, unless the situation is an
Yeah,
extreme emergency.
exactly. Which is carved out and defined under the bill.
Okay. And you will, the bill is going to clearly state that
It is
these are
stating that.
It is stating that.
That's why I said
Okay.
I would request people to read it, because there is always going to be a debate or a school of people who are the absolutists of privacy. That says the government must never have access,
Right.
or that the rights to privacy must be an absolute right. But in our scheme of things,
Sure.
it is a fundamental right. And every fundamental right comes with reasonable restrictions, which is, for example, in the case of a national security event or an incident,
Okay.
the government certainly has the right to and must to protect all those who are threatened by the national security
Fair
incident.
enough, fair enough. Now that's a huge clarification there, Mr. Chandrasekhar. I also want to ask you, industry has raised some concerns regarding dual regulation, industries that are regulated by, say, RBI or IRDAI or SEBI. Now their concern is that we'll have to follow rules which are set by the data law and by the regulator, and this is going to add to their compliance costs.
Look, first of all, I must share this broad thought with you and the viewers that we are at the early stages of essentially evolving a framework for the entire modern internet digital data economy.
Sure.
And so therefore, there will be instances where down the road there will be evolution, modification, improvement of the framework as we see these challenges and hurdles that we don't see today.
Right.
But prima facie in this bill, what we are saying today is broadly we have defined the data protection framework. But if there is a certain segment of the economy and a certain functional sectoral regulator
Right.
who believes that that sector, for example, health,
Sure.
requires a certain higher threshold of data protection
Mm-hmm.
or a higher set of rules and guidelines for a certain more sensitive set of data, those regulators are well within the right to do so. So the RBI may, as a financial sector regulator, turn around tomorrow and prescribe rules or prescribe guidelines that are much more rigorous, let me say,
Okay.
or less rigorous for some class of personal data that they may consider much more sensitive. And that is within this framework, they are allowed to do that.
Okay.
So therefore, it could be very much the case that certain sectors and certain classes of personal data, as decided by the sectoral regulator, have higher degrees of protection and therefore higher degrees of consequences of breach.
Okay. Regarding transfer of data, that's a list again. There'll be countries that will be blacklisted where data cannot be transferred. Do we know which countries are?
No, again, I must request you, Shweta, to look at this bill as a framework that we are starting with and will continuously evolve.
Sure.
And so therefore what we are saying today is the original draft, as you recall, had this framework where we said there will data protection or transfer of data outside for processing is prohibited unless we whitelist it.
Got it. Yeah.
That was the original
Right.
formulation. Instead, during consultation, it came up, and definitely we're discussing with the other parts of the government as well, that it is better to start with a permitted whitelist and then create a blacklist of geographies where the law does not apply or the rights of our data principles, which are our citizens, are not enforceable, and then progressively build a framework where there's a blacklist of geographies where data should not be processed. So we start with the assumption that every geography, or indeed all the data platforms will only use trusted geographies. But if it comes out that down the road we find that in a certain geography or a certain country, the platform that is processing the data, the laws and the rights that have been given to Indian citizens cannot be enforced there, we will certainly make that a blacklisted no-go geography.
Okay. But you know, the other counter argument to that is also that you're allowing data to go out of the country, and how do you regulate that? How do you regulate that? How crucial personal information of Indian citizens will not be abused?
Yeah, therefore, that is the point I want to make, that the moment a data platform, which is what we call data fiduciary under the law, is operating in India and collecting data from an Indian citizen or a data principal, the law applies. Regardless of whether the person processes the data in Timbuktu or in London or New York or wherever, the entity is obliged under the law to protect the Indian citizens' data. If that Indian citizen's data is breached for whatever reason, that we don't get into that reason at all, he is then liable under the law for the punitive consequences of the data breach. So it is for the data fiduciary to be very, very careful that he does not choose a geography or he does not choose a place to process Indian citizens' data where the law can be easily breached or broken. We have made it very clear that we will not go looking around for who's liable for the breach. It will be the platform regardless of how many other data processes the platform uses. Now, for example, I am the platform and you are the citizen, you give me the data. I am liable to you and under the Indian law liable to protect your data. Regardless of whether I use the Amazon cloud in the US or I use the Microsoft cloud in the UK or any other cloud wherever in the world. If I breach the data or the data is breached from any of the places where the data is stored, I am liable to you and I am liable to the Data Protection Board and I will be charged a penalty.
Okay. I want to talk to you about the Data Protection Board. Now, that's another authority that the government is setting up.
Yes.
There are questions regarding, how will you ensure that the Data Protection Board is independent? Because the chairperson, its members are going to be appointed by the government. How will you ensure that the Data Protection Authority does not overstep its mandate? Because you're vesting a huge amount of powers in it. You're giving it the power to recall content, to flag content. How will you ensure independence?
Now look, and again, I think this needs to be clarified very simply. The Data Protection Board today has been designed and will be constituted once the Act is notified for the specific purpose of adjudicating the consequences of a breach under the law.
Okay.
It is not a regulator.
Okay.
It is not an authority in the sense that you think of RBI or SEBI.
Sure.
It is a board that will say, I have received a complaint, I am the board, you have sent me a complaint that your data has been breached by him. I will ascertain the consequences of the breach and I will enforce a penalty, investigate it and enforce a penalty on the platform that has breached the data. It is a very narrow function that the DPB has.
Okay.
Now, whether it has to be independent or not independent, I think is again an extraneous debate because it is not a regulator, number one. Number two, every decision of the DPB will be appealable to the TDSAT and then to the court system.
Okay.
So there is enough oversight
Okay.
and there is enough scrutiny on all of its decisions to make sure that it does its job well. The issue is not independence, it's accountability.
Right.
We have designed the DPB to be accountable to those who are the principal stakeholders of the DPDP bill, which is the citizen or the small business or the business that is entrusting another business with its data. So the argument gets, in my humble opinion, of independence is a misguided argument here because this is not about independence. It's about performance and accountability, and we are very confident with the way we have designed the Data Protection Board.
Right.
It will be an accountable organization. It will be accountable under law. It will be accountable through the transparency that it's going to be operating under.
So do we know who the chairperson will be?
No, I don't. I certainly don't.
Will that be somebody from the government itself, a
I-
bureaucrat
no,
or a
we are not-
technocrat?
No, it will be somebody very competent. We believe it is a very important institution that is going to be in the overall ecosystem of laws and jurisprudence that is being built by Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji for the India decade. And certainly it will be somebody who's competent and will deliver what is expected of the Data Protection Board.
Okay. What are the timelines that we are working with? Right now there's a rule-making process that's pending. Then by when can we expect this data law to be implemented?
Look, let's first see the bill through the Rajya Sabha, which is an important part of the process of getting the law to be a law. Right now it is still a draft that is passed by the Lok Sabha, and I'm hopeful that in this session the Rajya Sabha will pass it. And once that is passed, I think there is a process of, like you said, framing the rules, notifying the rules, notifying the law, creating the institutional framework of the DPB. I see no reason why the government will be anything but fast and swift. As you have seen us in the last few months, we believe this is a bill that is important for the citizens, it's important for the innovation economy, and it's important for the government as well. So. I can't give you a specific timeline or the date of the month or the month
So
of the year.
the GDPR model gave 2 years for companies to transition.
Okay, you're talking about transition.
Yeah.
Look, I think that's a conversation that we will have because there is an interesting conundrum here. GDPR was enacted at a time where the whole world was at almost a starting line of this conversation about privacy.
Sure.
In India, we've had 3 years, almost 3, 4, 5 years of a discussion on privacy and data protection. So the industry more or less is aware, sensitized to it. Plus, I think we must never forget that the reciprocal side of this is the citizen. And that there is no built-in incentive for us to delay the protection of citizens' rights for anything other than that is reasonable. So while people may argue that there should be a longer transition period, etc., etc., I would argue right back that this has to be a balance between giving business the right amount of time, giving all the entities the right amount of time to transition, plus the fact that we want citizens to have the confidence that the practice of misuse and exploitation is going to come to a halt soon.
Okay. So 2024 elections before that? Or are we going to wait
Look,
for elections?
like with most things that Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government does, we don't operate on an election cycle. These are good things that need to be done for our economy and the digital economy and for the digital Nagriks, and we will certainly do it at the earliest that we can.
Okay. I want to turn a little bit now from the data law to a decision that has really sent shivers down, especially the industry, electronics industry, the decision to place import curbs on laptops, PCs and tablets. Now, one would think that considering the amount of coverage we've been giving to Mr. Modi's visits to, across the world, his meetings with Mr. Biden, with the Prime Minister of France and so on, one would think that India is pitching itself as an investment destination, but then we come out with a measure like this, which is so 80s. Right? I mean, you're talking about a globalized world, and then you're placing import restrictions on an industry that is 80 to 90% dependent on imports. What are we doing here, Mr. Chandrasekhar?
No, look, I think part of it is that this has not been understood clearly, and maybe it is our fault that we did not communicate this. This is certainly not an attempt to go back to the license Raj. I want to be very clear. It is certainly not about creating curbs. It is about really, ensuring that we have a trusted supply chain for our digital economy. That means the computers and the systems that come here come from sources that are trusted. And we are that is a very important objective, public policy and a goal for us as a government. As we increase the digitization of our economy, we certainly want to make sure that the elements of hardware that are going into the digital economy are all monitored and come from trusted sources. So this should have been, hindsight, this should not have been called curbs or licensing. This should have been called more of an import management system. This is really about understanding where the imports are coming from and where the imports should come from, and not allow imports from certain sources. Second is, we certainly are very clear in our goals and objectives, and we made it very clear in 2021. The Prime Minister has laid out a goal target for us in the electronics sector, that we want to grow this to $300 billion of manufacturing, and by doing broadening of various categories. And we have come up with an IT hardware PLI, and we expect to see a large amount of growth in domestic manufacturing in that category, because our own demand in India for the cloud, for data centers, for our hardware, IT, laptops and tablets are also going to go sky high. India is today one of the fastest growing markets for IT hardware in the world, when the rest of the world is almost flat or declining. So we certainly believe that the second prong of our objective is that we want more and more domestic production and a shift of supply chains that are already shifting outside of China.
But this is...
so therefore this
does not tie in with the broader vision that
No, it is certainly about that, but I think the comms of it, the communications of it, because it was called licensing, was misunderstood to say we want to put the brakes on imports. It is certainly not that. Because if the digital economy goal is $1 trillion, certainly you can't do the digital economy without computers and servers and the cloud and data centers. So therefore there is no attempt at all in throttling the demand or throttling the consumption of IT hardware in this market. But certainly, like I said, there is now 3 or 4 months that we have given the industry. We are sitting down and working out a framework of how the government's goals can be met, the India's goals can be met without disrupting what is the current business model and current growth and ambition of these companies.
So industry is keen that they at least get a year to adapt to this.
No, look, we'll speak. Look, there is no intention, and I said this when I met them, to calm the frayed nerves that you talked about. And I think I have explained ourselves very clearly that we have no intention of this being interpreted as a hammer to change some sort of a disruptive or a disruptive policy, to change some sort of a model that they already have. We want to work with industry as we have worked. We have done that in the smartphone category, where there are global brands today that are using India as a very successful base, and we want the global brands in IT hardware to also basically grow more and do more manufacturing in India. How to do it? Certainly The import management system is one element of it, but there are other elements, including the PLI, that we are
Right.
focusing
So
on.
incentives always work better
Of
than
course,
tariffs.
that we believe that, I mean, there's no need for us to be told that, because if you see the smartphone success,
Right.
it is about incentive, it's about a partnership between industry and the government, and today we have almost every global brand manufacturing in India and exporting from India. So
Right.
we want to replicate that model here, not create any new model.
Okay. My final question, since India is the shining star at the moment,
Yes.
I want to talk to you about, what's the sense that you're getting when you meet investors on what is it that's making them so bullish about India? And I want to get your vision and your thoughts on India.
No, it is very clear, Shweta. There is no, again, there is no nuclear science. I think apart, there are people who say the India moment is here, and India is clearly at an inflection point, and there's absolutely complete agreement on that. Part of the reason that India is now a contender in this sort of a post-COVID redrawing of the global economy, where value chains and supply chains are shifting, the relationship between the great powers and India are only going stronger. The presence of technology and digital in the future of economies worldwide is increasing. Our demographics is playing to that advantage of what the globe wants in terms of skills. So if you look at every trend, it plays to our strengths. Now, to paraphrase what Tim Cook said when he met me, he said one of the reasons why India is able to ramp up and adapt to all of these opportunities so fast, as these opportunities are opening up in the near last 2 years,
Right.
is because of what has happened in the last 7 years before that. For example, manufacturing. The only reason we are able to bootstrap and grow so rapidly on manufacturing in smartphones is all the pre-2018-19 legwork that went into creating ease of doing business and the policy framework for these investments.
Right.
So I think we are here today at a time and a place where the global economy is increasingly digitizing and looking for trusted partners. And India, if amongst all the countries that are there as candidates, fits the best bill for a country which has youth and demographics on its side, technology capabilities that are just tremendously earning the world's respect, and the fact that our own ambitions, our own capacity and capability to do things at scale are being demonstrated to the world.
Right.
In the past, the story about India was great potential but disappointing.
Sure.
Today it's about great potential and exceeding expectations. And I think that is what has got the world's attention. And that is certainly what is going to keep us going for the next 4 or 5 years as we go down what Prime Minister Narendra Modi says is the path to being a developed nation.
All right. Thank you so much,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Chandrasekhar. We do echo your optimism here at Money Control,
Thank you.
and we do hope that the government continues to come out with progressive policies which gives out the right message
You
to
can
the
be
world.
assured that we will work hard at that. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for watching.